Hello, welcome back. So, Cauldrons. We're getting into the dark half of the year here in Britain, and it's starting to feel a little bit witchy in this part of the West Country. So I thought I'd do a video about cauldrons. So, the Holy Grail, the Fountain of Youth, all of these images of myth and also popular culture, they all stem back to a particular set of Celtic cauldrons in the folklore. And there's one particular cauldron that I'm going to tell a story about in a minute, and that's the Cauldron of Ceridwen, the cauldron of inspiration and rebirth. And if you want to skip to that story, then do it down there. First, though, a bit of a preamble. The area where I live in North Wiltshire corresponds to an Anglo-Saxon kingdom called the Kingdom of the Wicca. Now, this same kingdom of the witch in the Iron Age, in the Celtic times, was of the Bunny tribe. In this time, this was a place well known for sacred wells, sacred springs. The Romans built many temples on top of Celtic sacred springs, sacred cauldrons, if you like. So, in a sense, we've got a link in history and archaeology as well, from contemporary paganism all the way back through the early medieval to the Iron Age and even before, because of course we find Bronze Age cauldrons like this one. So a huge continuity with this object, this symbolic object, this bowl. Now, we see this a lot in the folklore of the Celtic period. There's heaps of bloody cauldrons, right? One example of a male cauldron deity, they're usually female, but one example of a male one in Irish mythology, the Dagda, or the Doida, the good god, who's one of the children of Danu. He's this jolly, giant man, but also with this sort of inspirational wisdom. And he's got this cauldron that always replenishes itself. Whatever meal you cook in it, and no matter how many people sit down to eat, it's always refilled. Sort of a cauldron of plenty. So then we see echoes of that in sort of later cornucopia and even the Holy Grail, things like that. This idea of plenty, this bowl of plenty. The other thing about the Dagda is he's got a club that kills people with one end and resurrects people with the other end. This resurrection idea, again, we see in the British Celtic mythology as well. In the Mabinogion, the Welsh mythology, there's Branwen. She has a cauldron of rebirth. This cauldron of Branwen, if you put dead warriors in it, they come out again as living warriors. And not just in mythology do these cauldrons occur in the Celtic world. One of my favourite examples of a physical cauldron is the Gundestrupp bowl, which is here, maybe. The Gundestrupp bowl, very fascinating object, made of silver this time. We don't know what was in this massive silver bowl. It could have been mead or milk or blood, who knows. But as it would have perhaps been emptied of whatever was in it, you would have seen all sorts of images on the inside of this bowl, one of which is here on my arms. This is sometimes called the resurrection plate, and it has a series of warriors. Sometimes they're described as dead warriors in the underworld marching this way, and then there's a kind of god dumping them in a cauldron, and they're emerging either as living soldiers or perhaps in the other world. It's not clear, but clearly here in the archaeological evidence, a cauldron of resurrection. So, Ceridwen and the cauldron of inspiration and the birth of Taliesin. Long ago, long ago, there was a sorceress, a witch, if you like, and her name was Ceridwen. Now, no one knew how old she was. She was possibly older than the world itself, but she had great knowledge and magical power. Now, Ceridwen, she lived with a husband whose name was Tegid, the Bald. And between them, they had 2 children. One, oh, she was fair and intelligent and kind and just a joy to behold. The other, whose name was Avagdu, well, he wasn't. He was thick as mince and ugly as sin. He was crooked and hideous to look at. Not only ugly, but stupid. No. He would not do well in the world. But Ceridwen, for all her magical power, she could not make him beautiful. But she could make him wise and powerful beyond all the dreams of mortal men. So, in order to do this and give him the best possible opportunity in this harsh world, she set about brewing a potion of wisdom and inspiration. Now, this is a special thing. It had 2 parts to it. It was inspiration, creativity, art, and science. It was the ultimate potion of knowledge and power, creative power. Very, very difficult to make. Only Ceridwen knew how to make it. It involved picking of certain herbs at certain times of the year, under certain stars, certain phases of the moon, certain planetary auspicious times. The thing about this potion is it had to be brewing for a year and a day. Luckily for Ceridwen, she also had a couple of slaves, right? One of them was an old blind man, and the other one was a young peasant boy, and his name was Gwion Bach. The old man's job it was just to stir the cauldron, that's all. He had to keep stirring for a whole year and a day, and Gwion had to go out into the forest and collect sticks, just little sticks, and he'd have to spend all day and all night feeding that fire. And the cauldron was starting to near completion now. It was 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and it was just starting to, colours were starting to swirl in it. It was starting to bubble and boil. And this was a very, very delicate moment in the preparation of this brew, and things were getting dicey. And Ceridwen just had a few more herbs to gather. So she went out into the forest to gather the last few ingredients that she needed to put into that cauldron. And she gave Gwion Bach a warning: do not let anything happen to that cauldron in the next day and night. Thing is, that old man was getting pretty old now, and he just lay down and went to sleep in the corner of that hut, leaving Gwion not just to get the sticks to feed the cauldron, but he had to stir it as well. And Ceridwen was still away gathering herbs, and that cauldron began to boil, and nearly the time was past, and it was boiling too much. He could not do both. He could not stir and feed the fire, and the cauldron was boiling. 3 boiling drops of that cauldron just leapt into the air and landed on his thumb, on Gwion's thumb, and he went ah, and instinctively stuck his thumb into his mouth. And saw everything. I mean, everything. Those 3 drops held all the power of the potion. His little mind was blown. He'd been a slave all his life, living in a dark hut in a forest. He saw suddenly all the kingdoms of men. He saw the seas and lands over the seas. He saw all of his past lives leading to this moment when he was animals creeping through the forest and sleeping in dark caves, sometimes in human form, sometimes animal, until he was born as Gwion Bach in a peasant's hut in the forest not far from here. He saw into the mind of that blind slave. He could see through the walls of that little hut into the forest, and he saw all the trees and the plants, and he knew their meaning suddenly, just like Ceridwen. And then beyond, at the edges of the forest, he could see Ceridwen herself, and he could see that she meant him no good. And at that moment, Ceridwen herself turned around and locked eyes with Gwion Bach. And in that moment, Gwion Bach could see that Ceridwen could see him too. Ceridwen's face fell. And in that moment, the cauldron split in two, because the rest of its contents, apart from those 3 drops, had turned to poison. And the poison spilled out onto the floor, put out the fire, and burned a hole in that hut. They consumed that bald slave. For some reason, he could see slightly into the future, and he knew what was about to happen. And just in time, he could step backwards and avoid his feet being burnt by poison. And Ceridwen, she saw what happened, even though she was at the edge of the forest, and quick as thinking, she turned into a whirlwind of malintent and sped through the forest and tore straight through the walls of that hut, and was just about to slay Gwion Bach for daring to steal the 3 drops of potion intended for her own son. But quick as thinking, Gwion thought, if only I could become a hare. And he did. He transformed, even as he thought, into a hare, and he sped between Ceridwen's legs, and she tried to, but he was too quick, and he sped into the forest and away into the night. But Ceridwen, she had the magical power of transformation too, and if Gwion had become a hare, then Ceridwen would become a hound, and become a hound she did, and she sped after Gwion through the trees and over boughs and through holes in the ground, always on his tail, just like the hound at the chase. And Gwion ran on like this, and he could feel the teeth of Ceridwen the hound right behind him, and then he came to a river, a dark river flowing through the forest, and he knew not which way to go, and he ran along the riverbank for a while, but now he could not duck and weave. That hound was gaining fast. It was just about to latch onto him, and he leapt into the river, and as he was in midair, he said, if only I could swim. And quick as thinking, he transformed into a salmon and plopped into that river and sped away. And if Gwion Bach could become a salmon, then Ceridwen became an otter, and leapt straight after him without missing a beat, right into that dark water, following, and that salmon was fast, but that otter was just as quick, and they were coming up to a weir, coming up to a waterfall, and Gwion the salmon leapt up into the air, but that otter came bursting out of the water, leaping after, and just at the very peak of the arc of that salmon's leap, Gwion thought to himself, if only I could fly, and in that moment he became a bird, a sparrow, swift. And he spiraled up and up and up and up into the shifting skies. But if Gwion Bach became a sparrow, then Ceridwen became a sparrowhawk, and without missing a beat, went wheeling in the sky after that little sparrow. And oh, they danced the dance of death in the skies above that dark forest, all over that dark forest, until they flew above the lands of men, a village. And that little sparrow, it could turn in the air faster than Ceridwen the sparrowhawk, but it was beginning to tire. Its little sparrow heart was beginning to beat so fast, and he knew that sparrowhawk was gaining on him, and in a minute it would snatch him from the sky. Just in that moment, Gwion saw a barn, a great tithe barn down in the centre of a village, and he spiraled down towards it. He could see a little slit in the walls of that barn, and he just turned himself sideways and flew into that barn. And there, on the threshing floor of that barn, were all the piles of grain from the harvest. And you know what Gwion did? He transformed himself mid-air into a single grain of wheat, and he fell among 1,000 other identical grains where Ceridwen could never find him. He was safe, or so he thought. For Ceridwen opened the doors of that barn, walked in, and Ceridwen became a black hen, and she began to eat grain after 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 grain. You'd think she would get full, but no, because of her magical power, she would never get full. And even though she did not know which of these little grains Gwion was, she knew that he was one of them. She'd eaten every single grain in that barn, bar one. Ah, there you are, little Gwion. And Ceridwen ate him up and swallowed him alive. And as that little grain went down into her stomach, she transformed herself back into her true form, placed her hand on her belly, and went, with a satisfied smile, knowing that she had eaten that little shit alive. But something was wrong. Uh-oh. That's right. In that moment, Ceridwen knew. She knew that in the fertile cauldron of her womb, a baby was brewing. That's right. It was Gwion Bach. And she would now have to wait 9 months to kill him. But wait she did. Oh, yes, she did. Sat by the fire, biding her time, biding her sweet vengeance as her belly swelled. And many times she thought of slitting herself open and pulling the little shit out and throwing him into the fire. But she didn't. No, no, no. She could wait. One thing she had was a virtue of patience. And she waited and waited and waited until the day 9 months later when she gave birth to the most beautiful boy she had ever seen in her life. He had shining eyes, and she did not have the heart to kill him. It was her own son, after all, but also it was Gwion Bach. So what she did was she swaddled him up and wove a basket, a coracle of skins and wicker, and covered it over, made sure it was safe, and placed it on that dark river flowing through that forest. And it went down, down, down river for many years, perhaps hundreds of years, till it floated into the sea. And it was floating along the Bay of Cardigan, where there just so happened to be a prince, the Prince of Aberystwyth. His name was Prince Elfin, and he was a lazy sod. He really was. He always absconded from his royal duties, wasn't interested in finding a wife. No, he just liked to fish. And he was fishing one day, and what did he find? No fish. No. A basket. What the hell's this? He thought. And he uncovered this thing, and suddenly it's a baby. A baby boy with shining eyes. And he thought, well, my father and mother have always been on at me to have a son. Well, now I've found one. So he took him back and showed him to his mother and father in the court. And by this time, on the short journey, the boy had grown from a baby into a sort of, I don't know, about a 3-year-old. And the king of Aberystwyth, he said to his son Elfin, "What have you brought there?" And the boy spoke for himself. He said, in perfect, pure Welsh, "I am Taliesin of the Shining Brow, and I will be your storyteller." So that is the story of Ceridwen and the Cauldron of Inspiration, and also the birth of the bard Taliesin. So that story, for me, really strongly illustrates quite a few things, but one of them is this idea of rebirth in a Celtic context, reincarnation, if you wish. In quite a literal sense, in one way, Gwion is reborn as Taliesin through the door of Ceridwen's womb, but also just the motif of animals changing into animals, and the thought driving the transformation. This for me is a folkloric residue of the belief in rebirth among the Celtic tribes, which is one of the few things we do know about the Celtic tribes that's written about in contemporary, usually Roman sources, that they believed in rebirth. That's why they were so bloody reckless in battle. Also cauldrons, again, a cauldron of rebirth, but also a cauldron of inspiration and knowledge. You might also think in this context other sort of cauldrons, or in this case wells of inspiration and knowledge, we find in Norse mythology as well, so a bit of a parallel there. Think of Odin and the mead of poetry, or Mimir as well, and the well of Urd, where Odin finds the power, the magical power of the runes. So some similar motifs there. And if you want to hear that story, by the way, I do have that. It's here, I think. I haven't worked out how to do that yet, but maybe it's here. If not, it'll be in the description. Also, an archetype of the witch. Sometimes she's described as a sort of white witch or a goddess, you know, a more benevolent figure, usually by contemporary pagans. Yeah, that's fair enough. I think she's ambivalent, really. I guess the point here is she sort of embodies that triple aspect of the divine feminine. In this instance, in the version I've just told, very much crone, you know, standing for death and destruction, but also mother, you know, the maternal aspect. She does give birth after all, and there's of course also the virgin aspect as well, in the sort of triple aspect of the sacred feminine, which sort of ties me neatly back to the Celtic tribe of this area, really. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that the you often see three female divinities together. They're sometimes called the mothers, but this could be another aspect, a old version of the triple feminine goddess that is so popular in contemporary paganism. So perhaps there is a link there, however tenuous that might be. Anyway, thank you for watching. Do please like and subscribe this video if you like me waffling on like this. See you again soon. See you later.